Audiobook Academy Biography presents Aristotle. One of the greatest intellectual personalities in Western history, Aristotle, Greek Aristoteles, was born in Stagira, Chalcidice, Greece, in 384 BCE and died in Chalcis, Euboea in 322. Scholasticism and medieval Islamic philosophy were influenced by his philosophical and scientific system, which he developed. Although the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment brought about major changes in Western thought, many of Aristotle's ideas persisted. For Aristotle's intellectual horizons to be as wide as they are today, he had to be knowledgeable in a wide range of disciplines, from biology to chemistry to ethics to history to metaphysics to rhetoric to philosophy of science to poetry to psychology to zoology. He was a pioneer in the study of zoology, both observational and theoretical, in which part of his work remained unequaled until the 19th century, and he was the father of formal logic, inventing a comprehensive system that for years was considered the sum of the science. However, as a philosopher, he is unquestionably the most notable of all. His contributions to political theory, metaphysics, and the philosophy of science are still researched today, and his ideas are still relevant in philosophical discussions today. Life. The Academy. Aristotle was born in the northern Greek region of Macedonia on the Chalcidic Peninsula around 384 BCE. Amyntas III, the Macedonian monarch and grandfather of Alexander the Great, reigned 336 to 323 BCE, had Nicomachus as his personal physician during the king's reign, 393 to 370 BCE. His father's death in 367 prompted Aristotle to move to Athens and attend the Academy of Plato, which was founded by Plato in circa 428 BCE. For the next 20 years, he was Plato's student and aide. There are a number of late Platoan conversations that may have been inspired by the work of Aristotle at the Academy. At least pieces of Aristotle's writings can be traced back to this time period. Aristotle, like his mentor, began his writings in conversation style, and his early thoughts reflect a strong Platonic bias. According to Plato's Eudemonia, one's soul is trapped in one's body and can only be freed by abandoning one's body. Aristotle believed that the deceased were more fortunate and content than the living, and that dying meant returning to one's true home. The Pretrepticus Exhortation, another young work, has been rebuilt by modern researchers from quotations in late antiquity. To argue against the practice of philosophy is itself an act of philosophizing for Aristotle, according to the Greek philosopher. It is for this reason that God created humans and bestowed upon them a godlike intellect, the contemplation of the natural world. Strength, beauty, power, and honor are the only things that matter. The Topics and the Sophistical Refutations, two of Aristotle's extant works on logic and disputation, may date from this early period. The first shows you to build arguments in support of a position you already hold, the second teaches you how to identify flaws in the arguments of others. Aristotle can rightly claim that he established the field of logic towards the end of the Sophistical Refutations, even if neither work amounts to a systematic treatise on formal logic. King Philip II of Macedonia, reigning 359 to 336 BCE, waged war on a number of Greek city-states during Aristotle's stay at the Academy. By 338, Philip had seized control of the Greek world following a series of humiliating concessions from the Athenians who had only half-heartedly fought their freedom. As a Macedonian living in Athens, it must have been a difficult time. However, it appears that ties within the Academy have remained friendly. At all times Aristotle acknowledged his immense debt to Plato, and his philosophy is more often than not an adaptation rather than an outright denial of Plato's ideas. As early as the Book of Logic, Eidos, see form, Aristotle was beginning to stray from Plato's idea of forms or ideas. In academic writing, the word form is commonly capitalized when referring to Plato's forms, but, while referring to Aristotle's forms, it is customarily lowercased, as well as concrete things. Plato believed there was a realm of unchangeable, eternal forms that existed above our ordinary senses. As long as it shares or mimics a form, it is a horse, he claimed. Aristotle argues in a lost work titled On Ideas that Plato's primary dialogues only prove that there are certain common objects of the sciences in addition to particulars. It is common for Aristotle to question the theory of forms in his remaining works, politely or contemptuously. According to his Metaphysics, the theory is ineffective in solving the issues it was designed to address. Due to the immutability and everlasting nature of these forms, they are unable to explain how things come into being or change. As though one could solve a problem by doubling it, Aristotle claims that theory just introduces new entities equal in number to the entities to be described. Travels. After Plato's death in 348, his nephew Speusippus became the head of the Academy, and Aristotle departed Athens for the rest of his life. Hermias, a graduate of the academy, ruled Issus, a city on the northwestern coast of Anatolia, in present-day Turkey. Hermias became a personal friend of Aristotle's, and Aristotle married Pythias, one of Hermias' wards. When Hermias sought to form an alliance with Macedonia, Aristotle aided him. This enraged the Persian monarch, who had Hermias imprisoned and executed in the year 341. In his only surviving poem, Ode to Virtue, Aristotle paid tribute to Hermias' memory. When Aristotle stayed in Issus and then at Mytilene on Lesbos for a few years, he did a lot of scientific research, especially in the fields of zoology and marine biology. Aristotle later added 2 short treatises, on the parts of animals and on the generation of animals, to a book he called The History of Animals, which was a misnomer. Even though he did not claim to be the father of zoology, Aristotle's extensive observations of a wide range of species were a groundbreaking achievement in the field. Insects with some of the characteristics he describes were not seen again until the introduction of the microscope in the 17th century, so either he or one of his study helpers must have had exceptionally keen eyesight. What a mind-boggling amount of research was done by Aristotle. More than 500 species appear in his treatises, many of which are detailed in great detail. This is a major focus of his work. Myriad details concerning animals, reptiles, fish and insects are a mashup of scientific research and superstition. Rare fish species he claimed to have seen have been verified years later. A biological problem that has taken millennia to answer is stated clearly and fairly in other places, such as the nature of embryonic development. Despite a smattering of the fantastic, Aristotle's biological writings must be lauded for their brilliance. A genuine scientist, he was always prepared to admit his lack of knowledge if the data was insufficient to back it up. While theories can be relied upon if their results match those seen, he said, hypotheses should be discarded when they do not match the evidence. When Philip II summoned Aristotle to Macedonia's capital city of Pella in 343 or 342 to serve as a tutor to Philip's 13-year-old son, Alexander the Great, Aristotle agreed. Although the Rhetoric to Alexander was included in the Aristotelian corpus for centuries, it is now largely considered as a fabrication. Nothing is known about the content of Aristotle's instruction. A vast empire stretching from the Danube River to the Indus River, which encompassed Libya and Egypt, was Alexander's by 326. In the course of his military expeditions, Alexander is said to have arranged for the shipment of biological specimens to his tutor from every corner of Greece and Asia Minor. The Lyceum of Aristotle. Aristotle, who was 50 at the time, was in Athens when Alexander the Great invaded Asia. He opened a school and a gymnasium called the Lyceum outside of the city limits. With the help of his talented research assistants, the Peripatetics, and the name of the cloister, Peripatos, in which they walked and spoke, he amassed an impressive library. There were no membership dues at the Lyceum, unlike the Academy, therefore the lectures were open to the public. With the exception of Aristotle's Zoological Treatises, the most of his writings date from his second stay in Athens. In fact, it seems likely that the principal treatises, on physics, metaphysics, psychology, ethics, and politics, were regularly reworked and updated. Aristotle's ideas are abundant and energetic, yet his style is often ill-defined and uninspiring. For all their rough edges, Aristotle's writings are methodical in a manner that Plato's never was. A modern reader can see how Plato's conversations are continuously shifting from one issue to another, spilling over into other philosophical or scientific fields. Before Aristotle's time at the Lyceum, there was no such thing as an intellectual discipline. Producive, practical, and theoretical are Aristotle's 3 divisions of the scientific disciplines. Naturally, the most productive sciences are those that produce something. In addition to the more tangible disciplines of engineering and architecture, such as the construction of buildings and bridges, there are also less tangible ones like strategy and rhetoric, such as the achievement of victory on the battlefield or in the courtroom. People's actions are guided by the practical sciences, including ethics and politics. For the theoretical sciences, which include physics, mathematics, and theology, information and insight are sought for their own sake, rather than for a practical purpose. Aristotle's connection with Alexander appears to have deteriorated throughout his time at the Lyceum. Alexander grew increasingly egotistical until he declared himself divine and demanded that the Greeks bow down to him in reverence. Callisthenes, circa 360 to 327 BCE, Aristotle's nephew and the historian of Alexander's Asiatic expedition, spearheaded the opposition to this proposition. Callisthenes was executed for his bravery because he was falsely accused of being part of a plan. Macedonians, even those who were anti-imperialist, felt uneasy in democratic Athens after Alexander's death in 323. Aristotle escaped to Chalcis, where he died the next year, saying he didn't want the city that had murdered Socrates to sin twice against philosophy. Many of his friends and family members will be taken care of by his will, which is still in effect. When he died in 372 BCE, he handed the Lyceum's library, including his own writings, to his successor, Theophrastus, circa 372–circa 287 BCE. Only roughly one-fifth of Aristotle's work has been preserved in the form of his collected writings, which contain about 1,000,000 words. Writings. For all intents and purposes, there are two types of Aristotle's writings, those he planned for publication but never did and those that have been gathered and preserved by others. Popular works make up the first type, while treatises employed by Aristotle in his teaching make up the second. Lost works. Platonic dialogues and other poetic and letter-writing pieces are among the masterpieces that have been lost. According to the surviving pieces, the content of the surviving treatises deviated substantially from their theories. An exoteric truth for the general public and an esoteric truth for students at the Lyceum may be expressed in Aristotle's works, according to Alexander of Aphrodisias, circa 200. Rather than reflecting Aristotle's public beliefs, most modern academics feel that the writings of Aristotle's contemporaries represent an early stage in his intellectual growth. Existing works. They are based on Aristotle's manuscripts, which he left behind when he died. Theophrastus and Aristotle's manuscripts were left to Neleus of Skepsis, whose heirs buried them in a cellar to keep them from being confiscated for the library of the Pergamum monarchs, according to ancient legend given down by Plutarch, 46 circa 119 CE, and Strabo, circa 64 BCE-23 CE, in present-day Turkey. When the Roman general Sulla seized Athens in 86 BCE, the books were bought by a collector and carried to the city, where they were taken by Sulla's men. Andronicus of Rhodes, the final leader of the Lyceum, compiled and published them in Rome around 60 BCE. It is commonly agreed that Andronicus edited Aristotle's manuscripts and published them in the form and order familiar to us today, despite many of the story's inconsistencies. Doctrines. Logic. Syllogistic. His claims to be the father of logic rest mostly on three works: Categories, De Interpretation and Prior Analytics. These works address words, propositions, and syllogisms respectively. The topics, the sophistical refutations, and the posterior analytics, a treatise on scientific procedure, were all included in the organon, or instrument of thought. Prior analytics focuses on syllogism theory, a fundamental inference process that can be shown by well-known examples like the ones below. Every Greek is a person. Each of us will die one day. Because of this, every Greek is a victim of their own mortality. To determine whether syllogisms are reliable, Aristotle dissects many syllogisms and their possible forms. Aristotle uses the term propositions to refer to these three declarative statements. A proposition is a statement that is only analyzed in terms of its logical properties. Aristotle refers to the third proposition, which begins with the word therefore, as the syllogism's conclusion. However, Aristotle does not regularly employ a specific technical term to identify the other two propositions, which may be referred to as premises. Aristotle uses the term universal to describe propositions that begin with the word every. To state universal propositions using all rather than every Greek is human would be similar to all Greeks are human. There are two ways to express universal propositions, positive or negative. Some Greeks are bearded, a particular positive, whereas others aren't, a universal assertion, and so on, a particular negative. As time went on, the terms quantity difference and quality difference came to be used to describe the differences between universal and specific ideas. The sage Aristotle asserts that in all of these kinds of assertions, something depends on something else. Aristotle refers to the elements that go into predictions as terms. Aristotle believed that terms might be used as both predicates and subjects of predication. As a result, they have the flexibility to fill three various roles in a syllogism argument. The main term is the predicate of the conclusion, the minor term is the predicate of the conclusion, and the middle term is the phrase that appears in each of the premises. Aristotle also developed the practice of employing schematic letters to indicate specific patterns of argument, a device that is crucial to the systematic study of inference and is common in modern mathematical logic. In other words, the style of argumentation shown in the preceding example is exemplified schematically by the proposition: if A is a part of every B and every B is a part of every C, then A is a part of every C as well. Syllogistic inference is conceivable in a variety of ways because the middle word can be found in a variety of places in the premises, and because the number and quality of propositions vary. The following are further examples. Every Greek is a person. There is no such thing as an indestructible human being. As a result, no Greek is invincible. It's possible that an animal has the characteristics of a dog. White is the color of a dog. As a result, all animals are white. The syllogism's moods were first coined in late antiquity to describe these many types of triads. For example, a valid argument has true premises and a false conclusion, while an invalid one has a valid argument with true premises and a false conclusion. An argument can only be considered legitimate if its form ensures that it will never lead to a false conclusion from truthful premises. Aristotle was interested in figuring out which arguments lead to valid conclusions. Syllogisms must meet certain conditions before they may be considered genuine, such as the following. At the very least, there must be a universal basis. An positive conclusion necessitates the presence of at least one prior assumption. The conclusion must be negative if any of the premises is negative. To put it simply, Aristotle's syllogistic is a tremendous achievement. Syllogism was widely thought to be the only form of logic between the Renaissance and early 19th century. But in reality, it's just a sliver. For example, it does not deal with inferences based on terms like and, or, and if, then, which link entire propositions together instead of attaching to nouns. Proposals and classifications. In his writings, Aristotle reveals that he was aware that logic goes beyond syllogistic. Similar to the prior analytics focus on generic assertions beginning with every, no, or some, the de-interpretationist focus is on general statement. However, its primary goal is not to build syllogisms that connect these ideas, but rather to investigate the ways in which they are compatible and incompatible with one another. When two contradictory statements are made, they cannot both be true. Aristotle refers to this as contraries. It is possible, however, that they are both incorrect if some swans are white and some are not. Swans cannot both be true and untrue, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. If one of them is true, the other one is false, and if one of them is false, the other one is correct. Such a pair of statements is referred to as a contradictory by Aristotle. It is impossible to make a syllogism with a proposition concerning a single individual, such as the proposition that Socrates is wise, because all of the propositions that are used are universal or particular. The categories are the best place to look for a systematic treatment of singular propositions. It begins by separating things that are uttered, expressions of speech, into basic and complex. Some examples include a man runs, a lady speaks, and a cow drinks. The specific words that make up these complexes include man, woman, ox, and so on. There are no true or untrue claims in basic sayings, only complex ones can be. The treatise's name refers to a list of 10 ways in which simple sentences might convey meaning. These are the categories. Nouns, like substance, verbs, like where, and interrogatives, like where, or how big, are all used by Aristotle to introduce the categories. Every category had a more or less abstract word at this time in the Middle Ages: substance, amount and quality, relation, place and time, posture and attire, activity and passivity. A predicate in a proposition can serve as both a predicate and an extralinguistic entity, and these categories are meant to classify them both. There are several ways to describe Socrates, including the fact that he was an actual person, substance, a 5-foot-tall guy, and a clever man, quality, and that he was older than Plato, relation, time. For example, on one occasion, some of his acquaintances would have described him as either sitting, position, dressed in an outer garment, vesture/cloth, or cutting a piece of cloth, activity, passivity. Socrates is pot-bellied and Meletus is wiser than Socrates can be easily categorized if one follows Aristotle's example. What about the use of the name Socrates in statements like Socrates is a human being? Into which category does this fall? First substance and second substance are Aristotle's replies to the question. An individual and a species or sort of human are both referred to as Socrates and Socrates is human. Consequently, this presupposition identifies Socrates as a human being. Metaphysics and physical science, form. Both the structure of a statement and the nature of its constituent elements are different in Aristotle's logical writings. Plato's Discourse, the Sophist, is said to be the source of one notion. It is in this book that Plato makes a distinction between nouns, the objects of action, and verbs, the actions themselves. While it's true that a proposition must have at least one noun and one verb in order to be valid, he argues that this is not the case when there are two nouns or two verbs in succession. Only statements like a man learns or Theaetetus flies have the structure necessary to be either true or untrue. Categories and the de-interpretation are both notable for their emphasis on the idea that propositions are made up of two distinct but interrelated aspects. Contrast this with prior analytic syllogistic, in which the proposition is thought of in a very different way. The building blocks are terms, which are not heterogeneous like nouns and verbs, but can be used as subjects or predicates without changing their meaning. The philosophy of words has a problem in that it confuses signals with their meanings. In the statement, humans are mortal, but is that a human trait or a human trait? It's critical to recognize the difference between merely using a term to describe its meaning and really mentioning it. The lack of quote marks in ancient Greek made it difficult to make this distinction. Aristotle was no doubt prone to mistake between usage and mention. The wonder is that he didn't do so more frequently given his faulty terminology. Physics and metaphysics. Physics, mathematics, and theology comprised Aristotle's division of the theoretical sciences. Natural philosophy or the study of nature, physis, as he understood it, embraces not only modern physics but also the fields of biology and chemistry as well as psychology and even meteorology. There is no mention of metaphysics in Aristotle's categorization. In fact, the term emerges only in his posthumous inventory of writings as a designation for the works listed following the physics. The branch of philosophy known as metaphysics, which he refers to as first philosophy, is something he does acknowledge. Physical science contributions by Aristotle are less significant than his work in the living sciences. For example, in writings such as On the Heavens and on the Generation and Corruption, he drew on the pre-Socratic tradition to give an expansive view of the world. He learned from Empedocles, circa 490 to 430 BCE, that the universe is made up of various combinations of the four primary elements of earth, water, air, and fire. Earth is cold and dry, water is cold and wet, air is hot and wet, and fire is hot and dry. Each element has a unique combination of the four basic attributes of heat, cold, wetness, and dryness. As each element has a natural position in an ordered universe, it naturally gravitates toward that spot. As a result, earthy substances tend to sink, whereas fire, if left unchecked, will continue to climb. It is conceivable, but violent, to move the atoms in other ways. Aristotle's distinction between natural and violent death is still evident today. It is now solely of historical importance that Aristotle's scientific writings be read. A treatise such as the Physics has a lasting relevance not because of its scientific statements, but because of its philosophical examinations of some of the conceptions that have permeated the physics of successive ages. Place. It appears that every body is located somewhere, and that every body has the ability to migrate from one location to another. In the same way that a flask can hold both wine and air at the same time, a person can occupy the same space at different periods. As a result, a location and the person who resides there are not the same. So, where are we? An object's location is defined by Aristotle as the first motionless limit of the body that contains it. Consequently, a pint of wine has its proper space inside a flask while the flask is motionless. What if the flask is in motion? For example, imagine it's on a floating punt. As a result, the wine will also be moving about, and its location must be determined by comparing its position to the river banks. According to Aristotle, an object is not only located in its immediate container, but also in the enclosing container. Human beings are not only on Earth, but in the universe as well. Here is where they all reside. The universe, on the other hand, does not exist in a specific location because it lacks a container. Aristotle's conception of place is clearly distinct from that of Isaac Newton's, 1643 to 1727, conception of space as an unlimited extension or cosmic grid, see cosmos. Even if the cosmos had not been formed, Newtonian space would still exist. No location would exist according to Aristotle if no living things existed. Aristotle, on the other hand, acknowledges the possibility of a void, but only if it is enclosed by genuine physical objects. Continuum Continuity is typically used to describe spatial expansion, motion, and time as a sequence of smaller pieces. An in-depth explanation of the nature of continuous quantities is provided by Aristotle. When there is only one shared boundary between two separate entities, they are said to be continuous. He uses this definition to prove that a continuum cannot be made up of atoms that cannot be divided. Because a line cannot be constructed from zero amplitude points, for example, no two points can be adjacent or continuous since a point can have no parts and consequently no boundaries separate from itself. There will always be other points on the same line between any two locations on a continuous line. Aristotle says the same thing about time and motion. Time cannot be broken down into discrete seconds since there is always a gap of time between any 2 points in time. Similarly, a moving atom would have to be accompanied by a stationary atom. Indivisible moments or points lack magnitude, because zero magnitude, no matter how many times repeated, can never add up to a magnitude of any kind. Any size, then, can be divided endlessly. Unending divisibility, on the other hand, indicates unendingly divisible. No matter how many times a magnitude is divided, there is always more to be divided. It can be divided indefinitely since there is no limit to how many ways it can be divided. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed that the concept of an endless number of pieces was illogical. Infinite existence, he claims, is just potential. Motion. Aristotle used the term motion, kinesis, to describe a wide range of changes. To illustrate his theory's emphasis on the concepts of actuality and potentiality, local motion is used as a case study, moving from one location to another. In order for a body to travel from point A to point B, it must be capable of doing so. Once this potential has been realized, x will be at B in the form of x. However, it is then at a standstill and not moving at all. So, moving from point A to point B is more than just the realization of a desire at point A to be somewhere else at point B. That potentiality has been partially realized. Because a body at the halfway point between A and B could be regarded to have partially realized that potentiality, neither of these options will work. Motion is the realization of a potentiality that has yet to be realized. He defines motion as the actuality of what exists in potential, as long as it exists, according to Aristotle in the Physics. The simple succession of positions between A and B does not constitute motion from A to B. However, in order for x to get from point A to point B, it needs to go via some location in between. However, traveling through a place is not the same as actually being located at the point. Aristotle claims that everything in motion has been in motion at some point in the past. This means that in order for x to go from A to B, it must have already passed via an intermediate location J. But no matter how close A and J are, the distance between them can be divided indefinitely. Because x is traveling at any given time, there must have been an earlier point in time when it was not moving. In light of this conclusion, there is no such thing as a first moment of movement. Time. In Aristotle's view, time, motion, and extension are three essential constants that form a symbiotic relationship. Extensive motion is continuous, and local motion is continuous. Time is continuous because of the continuity of motion. Time, according to Aristotle, is the sum of forward and backward motion. Time does not exist if there is no movement. In other words, this does not mean that time is the same as motion, since motions are distinct from changes, but time is universal and consistent. Time, on the other hand, cannot be sped up or slowed down. Indeed, the speed of a movement is governed by the amount of time it takes. But Aristotle claims that we see motion and time together. Observing the progression of a change allows one to gauge how much time has passed. According to Aristotle, the sun, the moon, and the stars' celestial travels are used to determine the length of time. The part of a journey closer to the beginning point comes first, followed by the segment closer to the destination. Before and after in motion, as well as before and after in time, are linked by the spatial relation of nearer or farthest, which in turn is linked by the relation of before and after in time. To put it another way, in Aristotle's view, time is generated from the spatial arrangement in which time is spent in motion. Matter. According to Aristotle, there are numerous ways for things to evolve. Change in the category of location is what is meant by local motion, as previously stated. Aristotle defines alteration as a shift from one attribute, such as color, to another, such as size, in terms of amount. Substance category shifts, on the other hand, are rare and require special consideration. For any change in amount or quality, the substance remains the same throughout the change in quantity or quality. In other words, is there anything that persists when one thing becomes another? Yes, according to Aristotle, matter is the answer. He states, "By matter, I mean what in itself is neither of any kind nor of any size nor describable by any of the categories of being. For it is something of which all these things are predicated, and therefore its essence is different from that of all the predicates." Aristotle does not envision an enigmatic being that has no form, size, or shape and about which nothing can be stated. He refers to it as prime matter or ultimate matter because it is devoid of all kinds of properties. As a fluid, it is neither water nor steam in and of itself, it can be both at the same time and in different proportions. However, this does not imply that there is ever a moment when it is neither water nor steam nor any other substance at all. In everyday life, we see several examples of matter undergoing transformation. After shaking a pint-sized bottle of cream, you may discover that it contains butter, not cream. Nothing has been added or taken away from the bottle's contents, they are exactly the same. However, what emerges is distinct from what was ingested. The Aristotelian concept of matter is drawn from examples like these. Form. Forms are included in Aristotle's system, but they differ greatly from Plato's conception of them. Aristotle believed that a thing's shape was inseparable, chorisτα, from the item it represented. Form and matter are inseparable in Aristotle's physics, and material entities serve as paradigmatic examples of form. Substantial forms and incidental forms are distinguished by Aristotle. The predicate human, for example, is both universal and substantial because it is a second substance, species or kind, regarded universal. As a result, Socrates as human might be defined as predicating a second substance, Socrates, or as predicating a significant form of a first substance. Accidental forms, on the other hand, are non-substance categories that are regarded universals. They are distinct from substantial forms. The attribute, wisdom, of a first substance, such as Socrates, can be predicated by saying that he predicates an incidental form of that first substance. Aristotle refers to these kinds of formations as accidental, because they can change or disappear without affecting the original essence in any way. Contrary to this, the nature of the substance upon which a substantive form is based cannot be altered without affecting the substantive form itself. Socrates would not be able to survive if he lost his ability to be wise, but he could survive if he lost his ability to be human. There is no creation of matter or shape when something comes into being. In the case of casting a bronze sphere, the finished product is not the metal itself or even a sphere at all, rather, it is a formed bronze. In the case of the human Socrates, this is also true. Because things aren't made up, they don't necessarily have to exist outside of matter and time, as Plato posited. The bronze sphere's form is not derived from an ideal sphere but rather from its creator, who in the course of his activity inserts form into the suitable matter. When his parents conceive of him, they give Socrates form by introducing form into the appropriate materials, which is why he is human. Plato's query, what is it that makes two human beings both human, is answered in the opposite way by Aristotle. Instead, he ponders, what separates two human beings into two distinct species? That's his response, it's not their substantive form, which is the same as Callias, nor their accidental forms, which may be the same or different, but their substance, he says. Individuation is based on the fact that matter, not form, exists. Causation. Aristotle specifies 4 kinds of causes, or explanations, in different places. He begins by noting that a statue is composed of bronze, which is a type of metal. In medical terminology, this is known as the material cause. For the second object, there is the definitional expression of the thing's form or pattern. An example from Aristotle is the ratio of a lyre's length of 2 strings, which is the formal cause of one note being an octave above another. Efficient causes refers to the genesis of a change or condition of rest in a given object. When it comes to making a decision, Aristotle presents examples of people making decisions, parents raising children, artists creating works of art, and doctors treating patients. The final and most important type of cause is the object of an action, the reason for which a certain action is carried out. This is referred to as the ultimate reason. When it comes to causation, Aristotle is more interested in living things' substantial shapes, not mathematical ones. A being's life cycle and distinctive behaviors can be explained in terms of its structural organization, or substantive form, in certain situations. As a result, the mature realization of natural form serves as both the beginning and the end of an organism's activity. Roots in trees and hearts in sheep can only be comprehended in terms of biological function when they are grown and develop to the point where they may be used for that purpose. Being. Being is whatever is anything, according to Aristotle. Because of this, the Greek verb to be is central to Aristotle's explanations of being. There are no restrictions on what can be the subject of true propositions using the word is, as long as the predicate is present. Both Socrates is and Socrates is intelligent have something to say about the concept of being. Every non-substance entity is either a property or a change of the material that it represents. As a result, Aristotle believes that studying substance is the best method to comprehend the nature of existence. Metaphysics 7-9, where this investigation takes place, are among his most challenging works. Both of Aristotle's explanations of first philosophy appear to contradict each other at first glance. Being, as a discipline, is theorized about as a whole, and the things that belong to being taken in itself. According to one account, unlike the specific sciences, it deals with the most general qualities of beings, insofar as they exist. According to the opposite side of the coin, first philosophy is concerned with a specific kind of being, namely the divine, autonomous, and immutable substance. For this reason, he refers to the study as theology. That these perspectives aren't just 2 distinct descriptions of being is vital to note. As far as I can tell, there is no single approach to explore what it means to be. As an example, When one studies human physiology, one analyzes the structures and functions that humans share with other animals. It is obvious that human qua animal does not exist. A similar way of looking at the world is to see it as a collection of all the things that have ever existed. To examine the cosmos as being is to look at it as a single, interconnected system that encompasses all of the factors that contribute to things existing and continuing to exist. The unmoved mover. Aristotle uses the concept of movement to demonstrate that the universe is a single causal system, culminating in Book 11 of the Metaphysics. Aristotle used the term motion to describe a variety of distinct types of change. Everything in motion, according to Aristotle, is propelled by something else, and he makes several, unpersuasive, arguments to support this claim. There can't be an endless number of movers, he says. Assuming that when A is moving, some B is also moving A, then when B is moving, some C is also moving B, and so on. An immovable mover must be found to bring this series to an end, as this series can't carry on indefinitely. This X must be an eternal substance since the motion it generates is perpetual. It must be devoid of substance because it cannot be created or destroyed by transforming into anything else. It must also be devoid of potentiality, because even the ability to initiate motion does not guarantee simultaneity in motion. As a result, it has to be purely real, energia. Aristotle believed that the revolving heavens, despite their lack of considerable change, were capable of change since each celestial body has the ability to travel somewhere in its diurnal cycle. A motionless mover is needed since these bodies are in motion. A mover like this cannot serve as an effective cause because it would necessitate a change in itself, but it can serve as a final cause, an object of love, because being loved does not necessitate a change in the one being loved. By traveling in a circular motion around the Earth, the stars and planets are mimicking the unmoving mover's perfection. Naturally, the heavenly bodies must have souls capable of loving the motionless mover if this is the case. Aristotle claims that the heavens and the world of nature depend on such a basis. When it comes to God, Aristotle is ready to use the term. This, he adds, is what God's life should be like. It is a never-ending state of bliss for a human being to experience the most magnificent moments of intellectual reflection. Aristotle wonders what God is thinking about. At least he isn't just drifting off to sleep like everyone else, he has to have something on his mind at all times. As long as he's thinking about himself, he's doing it. A thought's worth depends on what it's thinking about, which means that God would be degraded by thinking about anything other than himself. As a result, he must be contemplating the supreme being within himself, and his existence is a contemplation of contemplation, noesis noesios. A lot of people have argued about this conclusion. Some have viewed it as a profound truth, while others have viewed it as a piece of utter foolishness. Some have argued that Aristotle himself intended it as a reductio ad absurdum, while others have argued that it is the ultimate absurdity of Aristotle's worldview. Unmoved mover's object of thought does not include the contingent affairs of individual humans, regardless of the truth. Aristotle's causal hierarchy has the celestial movers, both moving and unmoving, as the ultimate cause of all creation and decay. And for this reason, metaphysics might go by a variety of titles. To describe the first philosophy of Aristotle, he describes it as the science of the divine, emphasizing its ultimate principles of explanation by stating that it explores the entirety of being. As a result, to begin with, philosophy is both a study of what it means to be a being and a doctrine in and of itself. Scientific philosophy. Syllogism theory is applied to scientific and philosophical purposes by Aristotle in his posterior analytics. There must be demonstrations, he argues, in order for scientific knowledge to grow. For the sake of this definition, a syllogism can be defined as one whose premises can be traced back to universally accepted principles. In the same way that axioms are linked to the theory of a science, these first, self-evident principles are linked to the conclusions of science. Aristotle believed that the most significant axioms were those that define the proper subject matter of a science. For example, the definition of a triangle would be among the axioms of geometry. This is why much of the second book of the Posterior Analytics is dedicated to definition. Even if the Posterior Analytics depiction of science is brilliant, it has nothing in common with any of Aristotle's own scientific writings. Scholars have searched for decades without success for even a single instance of a demonstrative syllogism in his writings. Furthermore, no ideal example of a demonstrative science can be found throughout the history of scientific inquiry. Aristotle's mentality theory. Because he saw psychology as a branch of natural philosophy, Aristotle devoted a significant amount of his writings to the study of the mind. De Anima, De Soul, is a systematic book on human nature, as well as a variety of smaller monographs on subjects like sense perception, memory, sleep and dreams. As a biologist, Aristotle rejects Plato's idea that the soul is in exile from an ideal world residing in a squalid body. The soul is characterized by its link to a biological framework. Animals and plants, too, have souls, which are the fundamental principles of animal and plant life. If life denotes the ability to sustain oneself, grow, and reproduce, then an individual's soul, according to Aristotle, is the actuality of that body that has life. Soul is the form of a natural, or, as Aristotle sometimes calls organic, body if one considers living substances to be a combination of matter and form. Organisms, such as the mouths of animals and the roots of trees, are components of an organic body that have a specific purpose. Aristotle arranged the souls of living things according to their degree of importance. All living things are made up of the ability to develop and reproduce, which is known as a vegetative or nutritive soul. As well as the ability to see and move, animals have a sensitive spirit and at least one sense faculty, touch being the most universal. Animals, like all other creatures with the ability to feel, can experience pleasure. Humans also possess the ability to think rationally, logismos kai dianoia, which is sometimes referred to as a rational soul. For nearly 2 millennia, science and philosophy have been affected by Aristotle's conception of the soul and its capacities. Unlike Plato and René Descartes, Aristotle had a unique take on the concept of the soul. For him, a soul is not an ethereal force working on a physical body. The imprint of a seal and the wax on which it is imprinted are as indistinguishable as the impressions they leave behind. The faculties of the soul, on the other hand, are distinct from each other in that they have distinct functions and distinct targets. Sensation and growth are two separate activities, and the senses of sight and hearing are distinct not because eyes and ears are different, but rather because colors and sounds are distinct. Colors, sounds, tastes, and smells all fall into one of two categories, those that are specific to a single sense, such as taste, and those that may be perceived by more than one sense. Motion is a common sensible because one can detect if anything is moving by looking at it or feeling. Despite the fact that Aristotle names this capacity the central sense, the brain lacks a specific organ for detecting common sense. The primary sense unites all of these senses into a single perception of an item when one encounters a horse, for example, though the knowledge that this object is a horse is, for Aristotle, a function of intellect rather than sense. In addition to the five senses and the central sense, Aristotle identifies other abilities, such as imagination and memory, which were eventually classed together as the inner senses. Aristotle's descriptions of the interior sensations, even at the intellectual level, are disappointing. When it comes to the hierarchy of human faculties, there is also an emotive faculty at the same level as the senses, which are cognitive. Reason can exert influence over an irrational element of the soul. It is called the irrational part. It is the seat of desire and passion, but it may also be the home of moral virtues like courage and temperance when subjected to reason. The intellect or reason, which is where we think and understand, occupies the highest level of the soul. Humans have the exclusive right to think, which is distinct from our ability to perceive the world around us through our senses. Thought and feeling both entail forming judgments. Intellectual understanding is concerned with universals, whereas sensation focuses on specifics. According to Aristotle, reasoning can be either deliberative or speculative, depending on the context. Passive minds can become all things, whereas active minds can create all things, according to Aristotle's famously difficult passage into Anima. He describes the mind as separable, impassible, and unmixable while it is engaged. This verse was the subject of wildly divergent interpretations in antiquity and the medieval period. The separate active agent, particularly among Arab critics, has been equated with God or any other superhuman intelligence by some. Aristotle was seen by some, particularly Latin commentators, as distinguishing two distinct mental capacities in humans, an active intellect that creates conceptions, and a passive intellect that serves as a repository for ideas and beliefs. There may be a distinct part of the human soul that Aristotle recognizes that is independent from an immortal. Apart from his basic biological conception of the soul, Aristotle also retains a Platonic vision in which the intellect is seen as a separate entity from the body, which may be found here and elsewhere. Aristotle's philosophical tensions between biology and transcendence have never been satisfactorily reconciled. Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics, the Eudemian Ethics, and the Magna Moralia, Latin, Great Ethics, are the three treatises on moral philosophy that Aristotle left behind. It is thought that Aristotle's son Nicomachus compiled the Nicomachean Ethics, which is generally regarded as the most important of the three. The Eudemian Ethics was often thought to be the work of Aristotle's disciple Eudemus of Rhodes in the 19th century, but this has now been proven to be untrue. Nicomachean Ethics and Eudemian Ethics share 3 books. Books 5, 6 and 7 of the former are identical to books 4, 5 and 6 of the latter. Aristotle's usage of the Eudemian Ethics in his mature years at the Lyceum, where he taught ethics, is the most likely source of the common volumes. The Magna Moralia most likely contains the handwritten notes of a former student. Happiness. His ethics are teleological in nature. There must be an end in order for life to have any meaning at all, i.e. an object attractive for its own sake must be the only reason why it's worthwhile. This means that if there is anything more important than all other things, it must be worth pursuing just for its own reason. Among the most common conceptions of the highest human good are the pleasures of eating, drink, and sex, as well as the pleasures of art and knowledge. There are others who want to devote their lives to good deeds in the political arena. Scientific or philosophical reflection is a third option for the highest human benefit. So Aristotle responds, what is a good life? With just 3 responses: philosophical, political, and voluptuary. His quest for ethical truth hinges on this trinity. Eudemonia, Aristotle's phrase for the highest human good, is commonly translated as happiness. As difficult as it may be at this point in time to do away with the term eudaimonia, what Aristotle meant by it was more a state of well-being or flourishing than a state of contentment. Happiness, according to Aristotle, is the reasoning soul's action in line with virtue. The parts and organs of individual human beings, for example, sculptors, all serve a specific purpose, and so does the human race as a whole. Thus, this function must be a unique one for humans. It cannot be development and food, as this is shared by plants, or life of the senses, since this is shared by animals. So it's got to entail our unique ability to reason. When we talk about the ultimate human good, we mean excellent human functioning, and when we mean good human functioning, we mean logical soul activity in line with virtue. Moral and intellectual virtues are 2 distinct types of virtue. Knowledge and understanding are the 2 most important intellectual virtues, and they are exhibited by courage, temperance, and liberality. They are all examples of the moral virtues. Virtue. A person's excellent characteristics are subsumed under the umbrella term virtues. There is no such thing as a natural ability, like the ability to see. They are long-lasting emotions, unlike the short-lived passions of rage and pity. Virtues are character traits that are expressed both in purpose and deed. The expression of moral virtue is found in a good plan of action, that is, a set of guidelines for how to live a decent life. It can also be seen in activities taken to keep the environment free of both excess and fault. A moderate individual, on the other hand, will not overindulge in food or drink, but he or she will also not underindulge either. As a rule, virtue prefers the middle ground between overindulgence and deficiency. When it comes to virtue, feelings are just as important. The temperate individual, on the other hand, will show just the right amount of interest in sex without becoming either lusty or cold about it. A virtuous action or passion is not possible with every form or type of action or passion, even if all moral virtues are action and passions. Aristotle cites murder and adultery as 2 examples of behaviors for which there is no appropriate dosage because any amount is excessive. Virtues, in addition to being concerned with how to act and feel, also operate as a middle ground between 2 opposing vices. Thus, the virtue of courage is surrounded by both foolhardiness and cowardice. In Aristotle's view of virtue, it is not true to say that it is an end in itself. It is a separate ethical philosophy that stands apart from other popular systems of thought. Unlike religious systems that emphasize the prohibitive parts of morality, this approach emphasizes the permissive aspects of morality. Different from moral systems such as utilitarianism, which determines the good or wrong of actions based on the consequences, is consequentialism. Aristotle, in contrast to utilitarians, believes that some actions are inherently immoral. Wisdom is the intellectual virtue that determines the moral virtues benchmark. Prescriptions for action, or practical syllogisms, as Aristotle refers to them, are a typical expression of wisdom. When it comes to practical syllogism, a good life recipe is followed by an accurate description of the agent's current situation, and then a decision is made regarding the best course of action to take. Effective moral virtues are inseparably linked to intellectual virtues, such as wisdom, which are necessary for practical reasoning. Moral virtue is required for an agent to support a recipe for a happy existence. In order for him to make an informed judgment, he must be able to accurately assess all the variables at play in the given situation. To be truly excellent or truly wise, Aristotle adds, one must have both wisdom and moral virtue. True virtuous conduct can only be achieved by bringing together the proper logic and the right desire. Practical logic is the foundation of all good deeds, so then, practical reasoning, on the other hand, might be flawed in a variety of ways. For example, A gluttonous person may structure his or her life around the goal of maximizing the present pleasure at all costs. Those who are intemperate per Aristotle's definition are referred to as such. Even if you don't believe in a hedonistic approach to life, you may nevertheless overindulge from time to time. Incontinence is Aristotle's term for this inability to apply a generally sound plan of life to a specific situation. Activity and ideals. The corporeal pleasures of food, drink, and sex are the domain of temperance, intemperance, and incontinence. When it comes to the subject of pleasure, Aristotle goes far further. The joys of touch and taste, and the pleasures of sight, hearing, and scent, are two distinct types of aesthetic pleasures. Finally, the joys of the mind are at the top of the spectrum. Philosopher Plato pondered the dichotomy between the pursuit of pleasure and the cultivation of virtue. According to Aristotle, the two are not in opposition to one another when viewed in their correct context. Virtue and pleasure are inseparable, and happiness is a byproduct of virtue's ultimate form of expression. Aristotle defined wisdom and understanding as the two most important intellectual characteristics. According to Aristotle's principal ethical treatises, happiness can be associated with either the pleasure of wisdom or the pleasure of understanding. While the moral virtues are assumed in the Nicomachean Ethics, true happiness is only found in philosophical reflection in the Eudemian Ethics, where it is found in the harmonious application of all of one's virtues, intellectual and moral. To assert that the Eudemian ideal of happiness combines the qualities of the traditional three lives, the life of the philosopher, politician, and pleasure-seeker, is to imply that Eudemian happiness is based on contemplation. The individual who is contented will cherish reflection above all else, but he or she will also be able to enjoy the basic human joys of body and soul in moderation. So it is not surprising that in the Eudemian ethics the service and contemplation of God serves as a norm for the proper execution of the moral qualities. Despite being mortal, human beings must try to achieve immortality as far as possible, according to Aristotle. Aristotle's political philosophy. In the transition from the ethics treatises to their follow-up, Politics, the reader is brought back to reality. As Aristotle puts it, man is a political animal, humans are made of flesh and blood and live in cities and communities. Aristotle's political studies, like his work in zoology, are a combination of observation and theory. A copy of the Athens Constitution, preserved on papyrus by him and his students, is among the 158 constitutions they chronicled. According to Aristotle, politics is a study of what makes a good government and a bad one, as well as how to keep a constitution in place, by looking at all of the constitutions that have been collected. As stated by Aristotle, all communities are aiming towards something good. A city-state like Athens, which he refers to by the term polis, serves as an example of a high-quality community. Families comprising men and women, owners and slaves, are the most primordial communities. The first self-sufficient community is formed when a group of families band together to form a village, and then numerous villages band together to form a state. A human being's capacity for speech demonstrates that the state is no less natural than the family, since it is used to describe what is expedient and what is inconvenient, and thus what is just and what is unjust. The establishment of a state was the greatest of blessings, because human beings can only reach their full potential inside the framework of a state. An individual, a few, or the many can govern, according to Aristotle, and they might govern for the greater good or for their own benefit. It is referred to be monarchy or tyranny when a single individual is in charge for the greater welfare rather than for personal gain. The term aristocracy refers to a form of government in which the interests of the state are prioritized over the interests of the ruling minority. Aristotle uses the term polity to refer to a kind of governance that serves the common good, while democracy is reserved for chaotic mob rule. Aristotle argues that monarchy is the finest form of government when a community is home to an exceptional individual or a family. However, such a circumstance is extremely unusual, and the danger of miscarriage is quite high, as monarchy corrupts into tyranny, which is the worst form of government. While Aristotle believed that aristocracy was theoretically the finest form of government after monarchy, in reality he favored a form of constitutional democracy, which he referred to as polity, a society in which the best qualified citizens governed with the permission of all. Aristotle's defense of slavery and criticism of usury have had a long-lasting impact on European political systems. Aristotle states that some people believe that the control of the master over the slave is wrong since it is opposed to nature. They're mistaken. Of course, a slave is someone who is, by definition, not his own, but belongs to someone. Though he acknowledges the injustice of slavery as a system in theory, Aristotle speculates that if non-living machines could be created to perform menial jobs, slaves would be unnecessary. It's better for them to be governed by a master than to be left to their own ways, though, because some people are so incompetent and brutish. Aristotle's antipathy against trade was rooted in his upbringing as a peasant, not an aristocrat. He claims that our things can be used for both appropriate and improper purposes. When used properly, cash should be used to buy things instead than being lent out with interest. Making money by getting a breed from barren metal is the least natural of all approaches. Poetry and Rhetoric. According to Aristotle, rhetoric is a science that examines many strategies for persuasion, regardless of the subject matter. Aristotle offers a systematic and often insightful treatment of human emotion in his advice to orators on how to exploit the moods of their audience, dealing in turn with anger, hatred, fear, shame, pity, indignation, envy, and jealousy, in each case offering a definition of the emotion and a list of its objects and causes. Though just the first book of Rhetoric survived, the Poetics is more widely known, despite the fact that only the first chapter of the former remains. Replying to Plato's criticism of representative art is one of the book's goals. To adhere to the idea of forms, which states that material items are simply imperfect reproductions of the real things they are based on, artifacts like paintings and sculptures are only 2 steps removed from reality. Drama, in particular, has a corrupting impact on its audience because it arouses feelings that are unworthy of an audience member. According to Aristotle, imitation, far from being the degrading behavior Plato depicts, is something humans naturally engage in from an early age and is one of the traits that sets humans apart from animals, as it greatly expands the range of knowledge that may be acquired. Aristotle contrasts poetry with history in response to Plato's objection that playwrights simply imitate common life, which is itself only an imitation of the real world of forms. The poet's role is to express what might happen rather than what has already occurred, i.e., what is necessary or likely but not yet certain. As a result, poetry has a higher level of intellectual significance and importance than history, because it speaks to the universal, whereas history simply speaks to the specific. In real life, most of what happens to people is a result of chance. Only in fiction can one see character and action come to fruition in all their fullness. Drama, contrary to Plato's belief, has a positive impact on the emotions. Aristotle asserts that tragedy must have scenes that arouse sympathy and terror in order to purify these feelings. Aristotle's concept of catharsis, or purification, remains a mystery to this day. People can gain perspective on their own woes and concerns by viewing tragedies, in which they can see how even those far superior to them can be struck by disaster. Legacy. Since the Renaissance, the Academy and the Lyceum have traditionally been viewed as 2 opposing poles of philosophical thought. There are 2 schools of thought, one idealistic and utopian and the other grounded in reality and common sense. This attitude is represented in Raphael's famous Vatican fresco The School of Athens, which depicts Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle's shared beliefs are more essential than their differences. Unlike the commentators of late antiquity, who viewed it as their responsibility to create harmony between the 2 greatest philosophers of all time, many post-Renaissance historians of ideas have been less observant. Aristotle's intellectual accomplishments are mind-boggling. He was the first actual scientist to emerge in the history of mankind. A pioneer in scientific technique, he was the first author to record observations of natural events in such detail and breadth that they might be used as the basis for a theory. A scientist outlined the numerous scientific fields and their connections to one another. He was the first lecturer to classify his lectures into courses and assign them to a certain section of the syllabus for the first time in history. Researchers from a variety of disciplines collaborated on a single project. His research library was the first of its kind, and he ensured that it would be passed on to future generations by creating a systematic collection of literature. The greatest philosophers of all time are still Plato and Aristotle, even after thousands of years. Aristotle, however, was the bigger contributor to the global intellectual heritage if their contributions to philosophy are equal. Every philosopher and scientist owes him a duty of gratitude. He is deserving of the moniker the master of those who know, bestowed upon him by Dante. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.